The 17th of January, the ZMINA Human Rights Center continues its work. I'm Svetlana Vachirenko. Today we'll be listening to the report on the persecution and torture of civilians at the Russia's planned terror. Today we are talking to Ms. Korenko, who is a documentarian at the ZMINA Human Rights Center, and Petruniok is also from that center. Will be joined by Serhii Bolvinov, head of the Investigative department in the Kharkiv oblast. Ms. Elizaveta, to you. The ZMINA Human Rights Center has prepared a report on the persecution and torture of civilians in the temporarily occupied territories. Will you tell us what your findings are and what you have found out? Thank you for those who are here and those watching us online. Today we will see the presentation of two reports. The first one is devoted to what was happening at the police station under the occupation in the city of Kupiansk. The other part is focusing on our previous research on the torture of civilians and the detentions. I will be talking about the first part, my colleague on the second. The city of Kupiansk was under the occupation until the 10th of March, and occupation lasted for 6 months. As always they would do, the occupiers have developed a system of torture cells, developed a system of unlawful detention of civilians. We know about the 4 places where these people in Kupiansk were detained. One of those is the pretrial center. The analysis has been conducted on the evidences of 30 people, 29 victims, and a relative of one of the victims who is believed to be missed. We don't know about this person anything until he was detained in a village near the Kupiansk city. While he was detained in the city, we know that much. All the evidence has been documented online. We have also conducted field research that we are doing monthly. As for the category of the detained persons, 1, these are the people who participated in the anti-terrorist operation, current Ukrainian military representatives of the law enforcement bodies, and the second category are friends or relatives or loved ones of these people. And second part are people that have been known in their community for their pro-Ukrainian political stance. We have also known about the meeting, the rally that took place on the 1st of March against the occupation. The participants of that rally were identified online by the Russian authorities, and some of them were detained. The person missing, in fact, was participating in such a rally, and he was known in the community for his open pro-Ukrainian position. The people were identified through different traits. For example, when people cry out the pro-Ukrainian slogans, or sometimes person was known to be holding a Ukrainian flag in the house, or the flag of the United States, or that of the European Union. That was a substantive issue to be detained, as a fact that the Russian is open in the support of the Ukrainian independence. As for the illegal detention and torture, this was done by the Russian Federation to suppress the pro-Ukrainian movement and to insert their presence in the city of Kupiansk, for example. As in other territories, the active participants and the people serving in the local self-government bodies, including Ukrainian language teachers, they have also used the practice to incite people into reporting on other people. This is not particularly specific to the city of Kupiansk. People said that they would leave the detention place while they have provided and reported information on those that the Russian authorities was interested in. The torture was targeted towards gaining information. The persons that the Russian authorities were particularly interested in, this is, they believe, those who would cooperate with the Ukrainian armed forces, or they were blamed for providing marks for the future bombardment. The people who share the openly Ukrainian stance were subject to interrogation. They were said that they were there to be re-educated. There is an example when a man was asked to change the Ukrainian flag for that of the Russian Federation, and the next day the Russian authorities were there at his household to see whether he has placed a Russian flag. We treat these as forced absence of people. People were not informed where they were taken. The relatives were not informed of the places of detention. There is no official information available for the relatives, and the places where they were detained, those who were working there, they would not inform relatives whether these people are detained in that particular police station. The only thing that we know that they would take parcels from the relatives for the people who were detained. That was the only way to know whether these people are detained in that particular place. As for the condition of detainment, in general, we can qualify them as torture. As for the isolator, pre-trial isolator, yes, this is a place for people to be detained, but what the Russians did, they created conditions that lacked to be on the level of the minimal human condition. In a cell designed for 4 people, there were 24 people held at the same time. The toilets were available in some cells. You can imagine 24 people in one place, one toilet, and the water was available only in limited numbers. Of course, they were maltreated, and they didn't have enough food. Even if they received some parcels with food, by the time they got it, that food could not be consumed. It would have gone sour. People said that they heard the cries of people tortured next cell. This is very traumatic experience. It's very difficult to live in such conditions, and we call that and qualified it as a psychological torture. The psychological threats and intimidation has been mentioned by all the people asked. They were threatened in terms of their limbs would be cut off. They were threatened with the fact that their relatives would be brought in and that they would see how these detainees would be tortured. The imitation of the firing squad, we have a number of evidence when people were taken out of the cell and they were informed that they would be shot down. They were held at the point blank, and sometimes they would fire a point fire, but that was a part of the psychological torture. On a regular basis, at that isolator for pretrial cell, people were subjected to physical torture, which is severe beating and electrocution. 30% out of 29, those who were giving public evidence said that, and 18 of them were electrocuted, including a 19-year-old girl who, for the first 3 days, was taken for the interrogation every 2 hours. She mentioned that she remembers only one interrogation procedure when she was not either beaten or electrocuted. In 5 cases, this had to do with the sexual abuse when the electrical power was connected to the genitalia of the detainee. They would use the electrical shocker, and this is what was done on a regular basis by those who were conducting those interrogations. These people were subject to physical beating against the wall, or people would fall on the staircase, and that was done on a willful basis. We have also identified 2 cases of death. One is Konstantin Mironov, who was a former participant of the anti-terrorist occupation and a teacher at the local college. He was detained, and as a result of physical abuse, he died on the 11th of September in hospital after the place was deoccupied. They have also forced people to labor. 13 out of those people asked were forced to work, and those forced labor activities was a condition for people to be released. At least 10 days, a person was supposed to come in and participate in the forced labor, which is a violation of the humanitarian law. As for the facts when people were released, after the representatives of the Russian Federation received what they wanted, all the information, people were released, and if a person was deemed to be helpless for them, he or she was also released. We also take notice of the fact when people were forced to leave into the Ukrainian territory, people were taken to the Pechirsk Dam, and they said, you are supposed to go into the direction of Ukraine in your band to enter the Russian territory for decades to come. And I know people know about the fact that people in the Kupiansk isolation center were released when the Russian forces were retreating, Ukrainians were advancing. On that particular day, when they started retreat, they also were conducting those tortures. People were left shut in the cells, but one cell people there was able to break through, and they released up to 20 people who were lucky enough to have left that isolation cell that night. It should be noted, too, that we asked these hostages whether they communicated with the law enforcement bodies of Ukraine, and we have documented record that 19 of them did speak to the Ukrainian law enforcement, but only 4 of them informed that there was a criminal case opened and the status of the state of their criminal proceeding against them. As for the psychological and physical health of those victims who were subjected to torture in Kupiansk, they're all similar to other places where people are taken hostages. People are deprived of their sleep. People see different nightmares in their dreams. As for the physical abuse, there is a plethora of consequences for the health of people, including their limbs and joints, because you know how terrible this is. People, including the fact that people were immobilized for a number of days. The people feel difficult to move and to walk. As for the psychological implications, we have recorded two examples. When one of the victims was trying to commit a suicide while he was detained, the other person, although a lot of time has passed, he is still haunted by the suicidal thoughts. We want them to get in touch with the different psychological rehabilitation centers. Hopefully it'll help. The main point is that people who are guilty of those criminal acts must be brought to justice. I would like to have as a panelist of us Serhii from the investigation department in Kharkiv. Sometimes I lose connection. Let me introduce myself. Can you hear me well? Yes. I am Serhii Bolvinov. I am the head of the investigative department of the main directorate of the National Police in Kharkiv region. And I appreciate the fact that you pay so much attention to this tragic history in our region. You see, in the territory of Kharkiv Oblast, we have identified 20 places of torture. This is the most known number of people being subjected to torture, and we are investigating the lion's share of those crimes. I will share with you a slide to show what we are investigating. As I have mentioned, 28 places of torture have been found. All of them have been investigated in detail, and we have documented everything we have seen there. We have received the material evidence where biological stuff might have been identified to know who these people are. Fingerprints were also taken. Of course, what we haven't seen there was enough documented evidence. But we know that there are registers, there are lists, the reports of those who were reporting how many people they detained and the list of persons who were detained there. Of course, we haven't yet investigated all the places. 3 of them are too close to the combat zone. You see, when police force are coming into those places, they're being attacked by the drones, and our vehicles have been attacked. As a result, we have a number of police force that were injured. My personal take on this, why there were so many torture places. You see, the Kharkiv region was very quickly deoccupied, and Russians were forced to leave a lot of material evidence and documentation. This has led us to imagine and know what was going there. It has shown to the whole world what the Russian world is. The Russian world is where people are detained in the street, they are severely treated, beaten, and tortured. A normal logic of human condition would not explain this. It goes beyond a human understanding. But these are the methods that we know from the Stalin era or the Soviet era. The stories we have heard from the people, and we have a lot of those documented. And I see eye to eye with the previous panelists. People testify with the stories that make police force wonder how come this could have happened. What we are investigating are now 10 criminal proceedings. We have registered more of them, but we are working together with the investigative forces. Some of the criminal proceedings have been filed. In general, we are seeing that 227 people have been recognized as victims. Unfortunately, 13 of them are now deceased as a result of being mistreated in those torture places. 14 of those are missing, and we have reaffirmed that 4 people are now in captivity. The major torture places were placed in the major cities, such as the city of Kupiansk, Izum, Balaklia, Vovchansk. Having said that, I will focus on the torture place in the city of Kupiansk. This was placed at the pre-trial isolation place at the police station in Kupiansk. What kind of building is that? Before the full-scale invasion, it was used by the Ukrainian police to temporarily detain people by the police for a presumed criminal act before their proceeding would go to court. This is an isolator for the temporary detainment, and it would house only 44 people, no more than that. There was a special place, the so-called special cell for 1 person. What we know now is that at the same time, they would hold about 150 people. To repeat, this isolator was designed for 44 plus 1 persons. That is to say, the facts that we have just heard is that people were detained in the inhuman conditions. They were held there against all the proceedings. From 12 to 20 people were housed in 1 cell designed for 4 people. Of course, this can be deemed as one of the factor of inhuman treatment and or torture. In a nutshell, this criminal proceedings includes now 67 victims that have been recognized as those. Their age is from 16 to 65 years old. These people are of different professions and social walks of life. But, of course, what is similar to them is that they were all people of the pro-Ukrainian position. Apart from men and women, these would also include school children, and I will talk about them later on. We know that people who were detained there, all of them, we know now about 150, the number might go bigger than that, but we are trying to identify all those people. We have at our disposal, as I have mentioned, all the documents in this torture place, and we are also using all the information that people provide about those torture chambers. Again, who these people are? These are farmers. These are school directors from the Kupiansk region and adjacent region. There is a school director from Vovchansk. A terrible story of how this woman was arrested and detained on the checkpoint because the occupying force was informed about her pre-war activities. The detainees also included pensioners, people who had served in the area of anti-terrorist organization before the full-scale invasion. In general, these people, they have something in common. They were pro-Ukrainian citizens. For you to have a bigger picture on that, a couple of stories. Unfortunately, we have 2 recorded and substantiated facts of deceased persons who went through the tortures at the torture chamber in Kupiansk. One person goes by the name of Konstantin. He was the inhabitant of Kupiansk. He lived there with his girlfriend, Lilia. In September, just before the city was liberated, they were at the marketplace and they were searched down by the Russian military. This couple was detained. They were severely beaten. Especially goes for the Konstantin. The reason is that his brother was serving in the border service, border protection service. It looks very likely that he was held in a separate place because on the 8th of September, Kupiansk was left and the Russians flew from that city. Somehow Konstantin was severely beaten, and it's very likely that at night he could make it from that place. He reached a house next door, and next door on the 9th of September, he was found by the Ukrainian military unconscious. He was taken to the hospital, and unfortunately, he died there. His diagnosis is that he was severely beaten, and he suffered from a lot of brain damage. Another story is about the person called Anatoly, a man who lived there. He was open about his support for the Ukrainian independence. He did not support the occupiers who occupied the place he was living in. He was taken from his home by the so-called representatives of the Lugansk People's Republic. He was held in the captivity for 19 days. In the torture chamber, he was unconscious. He suffered a heart attack, and when he was unconscious, he was taken to the hospital and unfortunately died there. The local doctors told us that he was suffering from the heart disease. It is still for us to exhumate his body and to identify the reason of his death. This is the procedure necessary to substantiate the reason of the death and to provide all the necessary proceedings. We know about the people who were held for more than 100 days. A 24-year-old man called Metro, he was a farmer, but in 2019 he was serving in the anti-terrorist operation zone. He was taken captive and he was being tortured for 114 days. Another person, Volodymyr, he was a volunteer distributing humanitarian aid. He was in the torture chamber for 104. Inhuman conditions were also the conditions where women and children were held. A woman by the name of Halina, who was the representative of the local self-government administration, she was placed for 2 times in the torture chamber. Once she was detained and she was released. And when she was asked on the second time whether she would go to informing and cooperating with the Russians, she said no. So altogether, she spent 90 days in the torture chamber. Another janitor who was working at the new post station, she was open about her Ukrainian position. She spent 91 days in those inhuman conditions. As I have mentioned, the torture chamber also saw children. This is a story of a youngster by the name of Artur. He was detained because presumably he didn't observe the hours that people were not supposed to be in the street, and that he was there for 15 days. He was forced to wear a gas mask, and he was forced psychologically and physically to a forced labor. He would wash the vehicles that belonged to the Russian army, and he was forced to clean up the cells. They all said that they were beaten by the rubber bullets, and they were also subjected to electrical shock. They were subject to other criminal acts. As we know that on the 8th of September they were released, And as the other panelists mentioned, these people found themselves in the street, and they were amazed at how many of them there were in the torture chamber. And these people began to flee the place after the experience. As for the proceedings, let me share with you that we have joined these cases into one criminal proceeding. Once we have a request from a person, it constitutes a one record in the general criminal proceedings. Our task is not to bring to the court investigation one case. We understand that there was an organized group that included the employees of the Russian FSB and Russian military and the so-called representatives of the Lugansk and Donetsk People's Republic that were subjected to the orders of the Russians, including the Ukrainians who betrayed the Ukrainian state and began to corroborate in the people's militia. They would put on the police uniforms of the Russian Federation, and they were serving for the occupying force. We are working very closely and tentatively, very cautiously with these weak victims. This investigation is provided by the Department of the War Criminal Investigation. These investigators know how to provide such a search. They have been trained abroad. We have conducted a lot of interviews and have conducted a number of forensic proceedings. We have now different reports, the lists, and other documentation of the occupiers. There is a lot of work for us to do. We are very scrupulous in putting this puzzle together from all the small pieces. We are trying to identify every person who was committing criminal crimes of torture. How open are people in their requests and in their turning to the police? Do they have problems with how to cooperate with the police? People, as we have heard, don't know the number of their criminal proceedings where they are participating. As for the communication with people, yes, people are frightened, intimidated. You can imagine what they have come through, what they have gone under. People sometimes, people are recognized as victims in such proceedings. According to the Ukrainian legislation, every victim is informed about their rights, and these people know all the information about the criminal proceedings that they are part of. I have mentioned that we have 68 victims. Other people, altogether there are 150 of them, we still have yet to identify them. These people have dispersed throughout Ukrainian territory and they have left for abroad. And of course, we will appreciate every aid we will have had here to identify these people, to try to reach out to them. But in their majority, people are willing to share their history. They are cooperating with us, and we are seeing no problems in communication with these victims. We would like you to stay online. Perhaps you will have a couple of questions from the floor. Can I turn to you, sir? Can we talk about the torture chamber in Kupiansk? That it looks as if a sample to be followed in all other places, that the methods of torturing is similar to all those places. Borys Petruniok is my name. I'm an analyst and a documentarian at the ZMINA Human Rights Center. The torture that we have investigated and documented, something we are doing since the September of 2022, we are investigating different places of torture in Zaporizhia and other regions. I would like to put that into a wider context to see what's going on and why this was going on. I would say that the Russians are trying to turn the torture into what I would call a practical instrument of embodiment, implementation of their politics. It's done personally and it's done on the level of the local communities. All these so-called basements and torture chambers, they are functioning openly. And all the local people know where this basement is and that there is a likelihood that people would be taken into that basement. That threat of being taken to the so-called basement, it haunts people. People are dogged by it, and literally we can understand how frightened people are. As other participants of this panel have suggested, the major task for the Russians is to identify disloyal population. They are detaining people who used to be serving in the Ukrainian armed forces, their relatives, the representatives of the self-government bodies, or the teachers of the Ukrainian language and literature, or other people who have been open about their opposition to the Russian Federation occupation. Well, it seems to be self-evident for all the people who run the risk of being detained. On the other hand, the Russians cannot come up with a reasoning for people to be detained. We have, as you have heard, about a person who in his backsack had a little Ukrainian flag or a football fan slogans of the Ukrainian football club. They were blamed for the fire set in the city of Odessa, and these guys were accused because they were having Ukrainian symbols, something that the Russians cannot come up with the reasons for people to be detained. But even if the loyalty or disloyalty to Russia, for example, when people break the rule, the local proceedings, people, for example, if they are known to be having anti-Russian position, people are likely to be held. This is the politics of them. They are using this as an instrument of the occupation politics. We can also be talking about the fact that the basis for these people to be functioning in the occupied territories. The Russians don't want the Ukrainian community to get together. Any sign of volunteer activities or any other actions that serve the community, the Russians see that as an implication of a threat. Another issue is that this is a torture procedures for people to be forced into sharing information. Torture is the way to get information from the local people about where other pro-Ukrainian citizens live, where the Ukrainian forces may be stationed. And in such a way, this is very practical, if we can call that, for the occupying force. When we are investigating these facts, we have seen in September and in August of 2022, what we have identified is that all these practices in different localities have been similar and identical in the smallest details, starting from the people who are supposedly coming from FSB, how people are treated when people are not the way they are convoyed, they are treated in those cells, everything is similar to a T. Under the investigation, torture has often taken place. We also know about the physical abuse in the cells themselves, but the methodology is similar in Kupiansk, in Balaklia, in the occupied territories of Zaporizhia. These investigations saw the increase of toughness, of severity of torture. They are trying to blow as much as they can. People are being beaten, and they are tortured with electricity and then beating. Sometimes they would pause and stop for people to understand how difficult their situation is when they see the bruises and all the sufferings on their bodies. The torturers believe that this would make people cooperate. The severity of the torture can also be dependent on the level of the receptibility of a person for tortures. It also depends on the severity of the charges. If people are believed to be participating in different acts of disobedience, for example, the rally in the city of Kupiansk, if the Russians know that this person participated in the rally, it's very likely that the tortures will be specifically severe. We saw something very special, the methodology of torturing. We saw when the foots of people were traumatized, they would beat on the person's feet, not very heavily, but because it's taking place so often. This is the torture known from the Middle Ages. That is to say, people will have to live with those traumas for the rest of their lives, or they would beat a person in the same place, on same muscle. Electricity, they would increase the power of electricity when the clamps are connected to your fingers or to your ears or to your genitalia. We also have seen the cases when people were washed with ice-cold water. All the consequences are getting more severe and severe. People are suffering both psychologically and physically. What we have seen also, the lie detector. You see, the use of the lie detector isn't compatible with the torture procedures, because they want people to be conscious and to be able to answer their questions, and they want to make sure that people are telling the truth. We saw this in Kupiansk, in the city of Kherson, and the difference of using that lie detector was only 2 days. And the questions that people were asked, how many questions were asked, and the way they were conducted, they all look similar. What does it tell us? These similarities are very important for us. It tells us about the scope of the criminal acts. When those crimes are conducted following this same playbook. Another way is that the logic of the Russian forces is the following. They know the motives, they know their goals and their tasks. That is to say, the imposing of the Russian authority, and to be able to frighten people into obedience. We hope that after the war, the Russian Federation as a state will be brought to justice. Not specific persons, although them too, but we plan in the future to put that at the doorstep of the Russian Federation as a state. The severity of the consequences of the victims. The traumas are very typical. Breaks, the muscles, different tortures, including the broken teeth when people cling their teeth to the extent that they break them. Psychological issues, of course, including the joints and the anxiety, nightmares. This all testifies to the fact that people are suffering from the psychological problems, and it will be there for quite a long time. The victims told me that even if they're not physically abused, the psychological consequences will not disappear. People are still suffering from those. We try to find psychological rehabilitation centers for these people to go to. The situation is very complex. Another issue that I would like to pinpoint, the victims and their relatives is one thing, but there are other people traumatized in the very fact that the local communities also suffer from the very fact of occupation. People are now very suspicious of each other. Why? Because the Russians have spread this culture of reporting on each other, including as a precondition for your being released. Social connections now are being degraded, and the Russians are doing that purposefully. They want to destroy the grassroots networking of the Ukrainian community. The fact that volunteers or activists or the representatives of the local self-government bodies are arrested is one thing, but it is very difficult to restore these grassroots connections. People who have suffered from the torture want to change their lives forever, and we are likely to confront such consequences at a later stage. We are now seeing something that we see from the evidence from people in the Kharkiv region. We should be mindful of that, because the implications of such torture chambers and torture of the civilian population does not concern necessarily every person, every victim. It will have a global consequence that we are likely to confront at a later stage. We know the challenges of the Ukrainian law enforcement, but one thing is that the victims don't know exactly the number of the criminal proceedings that they are part of. Of course, they must be helped. We are trying to communicate with the Ukrainian law enforcement. The matter is how to record the trauma, the different physical abuse. It's not easy, but we are continuing our work, because what we are seeing now, unfortunately, is a very difficult problem to deal with. Do we have questions from the floor? Ukrinform Yana Tymoshenko. I have a question. Now, of course, you are putting together all the records, you are dealing, sharing the information with international bodies. How do you cooperate with the international bodies? Thank you for your question. That goes a little bit beyond the scope of our report. You see, international partners are not supposed to be helping bring our victims to their countries. We are sharing the information on the tortures. International partners take note of that, and they will also file criminal proceedings. It'll take time. The matter is that a lot of victims have been demotivated to cooperate. They want the justice to be brought as quickly as possible, but unfortunately this cannot be done very shortly. This investigation must be done in full scale, to make sure that only those responsible for those crimes are brought to justice. As Borys has suggested, public organizations who are helping our victims, they cannot solely cope either psychologically or financially with these issues. This is something that the government will take care of, to create a comprehensive system of aiding people who have suffered from the torturers who have been illegally detained, something that this country is working on, and perhaps we should do a lot of work here. And we have enough monetary help from the Ministry for Integration, including the rehabilitation procedures for the civilians who have been illegally detained. Both our organization and our international partners are encouraging people to contact us and to share us their evidence. And this is quite a difficult process for the victims, because the document that would substantiate their claims and their histories, it takes a lot of effort. People have gone through such hard times. They would like to receive more help and more aid. But this is something that we are working on. Next question in English.
Areas where the torture has evolved. For instance, we know about filtration looking for young fighting men and potential threats to their authority, or the way that they use collaboration against each other. But do you see things that you are concerned with, especially since occupation continues, that we should be aware of? Дякую.
З цього приводу
On this point, I would like to say, if we can characterize this in the following way, the Russians have developed a system in this area, in detention of civilians, in torturing the civilians. What are the particular needs of a occupying force or their strategic agenda? Is something that must be investigated, but my take is that perhaps the instruments and the methods that they are using have been set. They are using something that has been developed. They have been doing that for some time. They seem to be of a similar type, which tells me that this practice, quote unquote, this practice has proven good. It seems that they believe it's working. It brings the results that they want. Whether this system will evolve, what changes we are likely to see, we'll be keeping track of on that. We are trying to gather as many evidence as possible. Although, for example, we have a number of problems stemming from the fact that it's very difficult for people to leave the occupied territories. The checkpoint in the Zaporizhia region is closed. People have to go through the Russian Federation, through the Western European countries. It's very expensive, it's very hard, and they are being followed by the Russian Secret Service. There are problems here, of course, but we are keeping track on how these proceedings are evolving and are likely to evolve. My view is that this has been set already. It has become a tradition. And there is a logic to it, that they are using the same toolkit to answer the question that they have. If the situation evolves, we will see that the situation of the civilian in the occupied territories right now is very difficult. It is likely to worsen. The situation with those people living in the occupied territory, they are being under constant pressure. They are bullied all the time. Our goal is to put those records together, to keep track of the criminals, to help the law enforcement to file criminal cases and do our best as we can. Thank you very much. Let me remind you that the human rights activists have been talking about the persecution and torture as the planned acts of Russian terror. We will continue our work together. Stay tuned and thank you.